My brother called at 2 a.m. and said I got arrested. I need $8,000 for bail, and I said no, and he said, "What do you mean?" No, and I said, "This revenge was never mine. I'm just finishing what Aunt Diane started," and he said, "Who is Aunt?" Diane and I said, "She's the woman who paid for your life for 40 years, and you never invited her to anything either." Hello guys, welcome by CJ to my channel. Please like this video and subscribe this channel. My name is Claire Westfield, and I am 36 years old, and 2 weeks ago, I sat in my apartment reading a letter my aunt left me before she died 3 years ago, and the letter said, "Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I need you to know something. I spent 40 years being excluded from this family, and I wanted to stop funding them, but I never had the courage, and I'm leaving you everything. I have not, because you're my favorite, but because you're the only one who understands what it's like to be optional, and I need you to finish what I started." And at the bottom of the letter was a bank account number. And when I logged in, I saw $217,000 and a spreadsheet titled Family Contributions, 1983 to present. And I realized my aunt had been keeping a record of every dollar she gave to the family, who never invited her to anything, and she had planned to cut them off, but she died before she could, and now she was asking me to do it. And 3 days after I read that letter, my brother called me at 2 in the morning and said, "Claire, I got arrested, and I need $8,000 for bail by tomorrow," and I said no, and he said, "What do you mean no?" And I said, "I mean, this revenge was never mine. I'm just finishing what Aunt Diane started," and I hung up. Let me take you back, because this story doesn't begin with me. It begins with my Aunt Diane, who died in March of 2021, and who I barely knew growing up because she was the family member nobody talked about. And when they did talk about her, it was always in the past tense, like she had already been erased. I grew up in a suburb outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, with my parents and my older brother Tyler and my younger sister Morgan, and we were the kind of family that looked perfect in photos, but operated on a system of unspoken hierarchies, and my Aunt Diane was at the bottom of that system, and so was I, and I didn't realize we were the same until I found her letter. When I was 7 years old, I asked my mother why Aunt Diane never came to Thanksgiving, and my mother said, "Oh, Diane is very busy with her own life." And I said, "Doing what?" And my mother said, "I don't really know, Claire." And I said, "Can we invite her?" And my mother said we did. She just didn't want to come, and I accepted that because I was 7 and I didn't know that my mother was lying. The first time I was told I probably wouldn't want to come to something, I was 13, and my brother Tyler was graduating 8th grade, and my mother said, "It's just a small ceremony, Claire, and you'd probably be bored." And I said, "I want to go," and she said, "Well, there's limited seating, and we already have tickets for the family." And I said, "I'm family." And she said, "You know what I mean, the immediate family?" And I said, "I live in this house." And she said, "Claire, don't be difficult," and I didn't go, and I sat in my room that night, and I felt something small and cold settle in my chest, and I didn't know it yet, but that was the first deposit in a ledger I would carry for 20 years. When Tyler graduated high school, I wasn't invited to the party because my parents said it was for his friends, and it would be awkward to have his little sister there. And when Morgan graduated college, I wasn't told about the dinner until the day after, because my mother said, "Oh, Claire, we didn't think you'd be able to get time off work," and I said, "I would have tried," and she said, "Well, it's done now, maybe next time," and there was always a next time, and I was never invited. I moved away when I was 24, and I built a life in a different city, and I came home maybe twice a year, and every time I visited, my mother would say, "Claire, you're so distant now," and I'd say, "I'm here, aren't I?" And she'd say physically, "Yes, but you're not really present," and I'd think about all the events I wasn't invited to, and I'd say, "Okay, Mom," and I'd leave a day early. My Aunt Diane died in March of 2021, and I didn't find out until a week after the funeral because nobody told me. And when I called my mother and said, "Why didn't you tell me Aunt Diane died?" she said, "Oh, Claire, it was a very small service, just immediate family." And I said I would have come, and she said, "We didn't think you'd want to." And I said, "Why do you always think that?" And she said, "Because you never come to anything." And I hung up. 3 months after Diane died, I got a letter from her attorney saying she had left me her estate and I needed to come in to sign paperwork. And I thought there must be a mistake, because I had maybe spoken to Diane 5 times in my entire life. But I went to the attorney's office and he handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Diane left this for you specifically." And he left the room, and I opened it and I read the letter that said, "Claire, I know we didn't know each other well, but I've been watching you from a distance, and I see the same pattern in your life that I lived in mine. And I need you to know it wasn't your fault, and it wasn't mine either. Some families have a way of deciding who matters and who doesn't, and once they've decided, they don't revisit it, and I spent 40 years being the person who didn't matter, and I funded their lives anyway, because I thought maybe if I helped enough they'd see me, but they never did. And I wanted to stop. I wanted to cut them off. But I was afraid and I ran out of time, and now I'm leaving you everything I have, and I'm asking you to do what I couldn't do, which is stop participating in your own erasure. And at the bottom, she had written, there's a spreadsheet in the safety. Deposit box, the key is with my attorney. Finish it for both of us. I sat in that office and I cried because a woman I barely knew had seen me more clearly than my own mother ever had. And I took the key and I went to the bank and I opened the safety deposit box. And inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. That said, this is 40 years of receipts, Claire. Every birthday check, every emergency loan, every time they said we didn't think you'd want to come, and then called me a week later asking for money, it's all here. And I was going to stop paying, but I got sick and I ran out of time. So now it's yours. Do with it what you need to. I went home and I plugged in the USB drive and I opened a spreadsheet that was so detailed it made my chest hurt. It had dates and amounts and notes, and the notes were the worst because they were things like Tyler's wedding paid for rehearsal. Dinner $4,000 was not invited to ceremony, and Morgan's car down payment $6,000. She told me later she didn't think I'd be interested in coming to her birthday, and the list went on and on for 40 years, and the total. At the bottom was $217,000, and I sat there staring at that number, and I realized my aunt had been funding the same people who erased her for 4 decades, and she had documented every single instance of being excluded and every single dollar she gave afterward. And she had planned to stop, but she died before she could, and now she was asking me to finish it. I didn't do anything right away. I just watched and I waited, because I wanted to see if the pattern Diane had documented was the same pattern I was living. And it was exactly 2 months after I found the spreadsheet when my mother called and said, Claire, we're having a family reunion in July, and I said, okay, when? And she said the 15th, and I said, I'll be there. And she said, oh, well, actually, Claire, it's at Morgan's house and space is tight, so we're keeping it to just the core family. And I said, I am the core family. And she said, you know what I mean? People who are around more often. And I said, so I'm not invited. And she said, it's not that you're not invited. It's just that we didn't think you'd want to come. And I said, okay, Mom. And I hung up and I opened my laptop and I pulled up Diane's spreadsheet and I added a new entry, July 15th, excluded from family reunion. And then I waited. 3 weeks after the reunion, my brother Tyler called me and said, hey, Claire, can you help me out? I'm short on rent this month. And I said, how much? And he said, $2,000, and I said, no. And he said, what? And I said, I'm not giving you money, and he said, why not? And I said, because 3 weeks ago I wasn't invited to the family reunion. And he said, that wasn't personal. And I said, it was completely personal. And he said, Claire, don't be petty. And I said, I'm not being petty. I'm finishing something. Someone else started, and he said, what does that mean? And I hung up. 2 months later, my sister Morgan called and said, Claire, I need help with a medical bill. And I said, how much? And she said, $3,500. And I said, no. And she said, Claire, I'm your sister. And I said, then why wasn't I invited to your graduation dinner? And she said, that was 4 years ago. And I said, and I remember every single one. And she said, you're being vindictive. And I said, no. Morgan, I'm keeping a ledger the way someone taught me to. And she hung up. 6 months after I read Diane's letter, my brother Tyler got arrested for a DUI, and he called me at 2 in the morning and said, Claire, I need $8,000 for bail. And I said, no. And he said, what do you mean, no? And I said, I mean, I'm not helping you. And he said, I'm your brother. And I said, and you didn't invite me to your wedding. And he said, that was 8 years ago. And I said, and Aunt Diane kept records for 40 years, so I've got 32 more to go. And he said, who is Aunt Diane? And I said, she's the woman who paid for your wedding and your car and your rent and every other thing you ever needed. And you didn't invite her to anything either. And she died planning to cut you off. But she ran out of time, so she left the job to me. And he said, this is insane. And I said, no, Tyler, this is overdue, and I hung up. Tyler stayed in jail for 3 days before my parents bailed him out, and my mother called me and said, Claire, how could you do this to your brother? And I said, the same way you did it to Diane. And she said, who? And I said, your sister, Mom, the woman who paid for half of Tyler's life, and you didn't even tell her when she was dying. And my mother went quiet and said, Diane chose to help, and I said no. Mom Diane hoped that helping would make her matter, and it didn't, and she spent 40 years funding people who didn't invite her to anything. And I'm not doing that. I'm finishing what she started, and my mother said, you're being cruel. And I said, I'm being Diane, and I hung up. I haven't spoken to my family in 8 months, and I don't plan to because the pattern Diane showed me is so clear now I can't unsee it. They decided a long time ago that some people matter and some people are useful, and once they've made that Decision they don't revisit it, and Diane was useful, and I was useful, and neither of us mattered. And she spent 40 years trying to buy her way into mattering, and it never worked. And she knew it wouldn't work for me either. So she left me her ledger and her savings and her unfinished mission, and I'm finishing it not because I'm angry, but because she asked me to, and because someone needs to close the loop on 40 years of being erased. I keep Diane's spreadsheet on my desktop now, and I add to it every time my family excludes me from something, and then asks me for money, and the list is growing, and I'm not paying, and I'm not apologizing, and I'm not explaining because Diane already explained it in a letter she wrote 3 years ago that said, "Claire, you don't owe people your presents just because they need your money, and you don't owe them forgiveness just because they're family." And the person who should have heard that message 40 years ago was me, but I'm hearing it now, and I'm listening. If you've ever been the person your family called when they needed something and forgot when they were celebrating, if you've ever found out that someone before you lived the same pattern and never escaped it, I need you to know this. You're allowed to finish what they started, and you're allowed to say no on behalf of both of you. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pick up someone else's fight and carry it across the finish line. They never got to see, and if that feels like revenge, it's not, it's legacy.